Welcome to Export Fundamentals. While we are waiting for everyone to join, please turn your cameras on and microphones off until you are participating, of course. The chat box is available for technical assistance now and for questions throughout. Have your worksheets handy to take notes. This training is for you, so please join in the conversations. In this session, we will help you learn how to determine your product's classification, what export documentation is required, how to choose a freight forwarder, what Incoterms are, and how tariffs and free trade agreements affect exporting. More than 95% of the world's consumers are outside of the United States. On average, companies that export have faster growing sales, have more available jobs, and employees earn more than in non-exporting firms. The United States is known worldwide for high-quality, innovative goods and services, customer service, and sound business practices. Most companies that export have an easier time riding out fluctuations in the U.S. economy and are more likely to stay in business. Advances in technology, particularly the internet, mean it is easier than ever to access export markets and attract new customers. The Idaho State Department of Agriculture and the Idaho Commerce Department are here to help you with your export needs. Thank you so much for joining us today for the third session of Export Fundamentals. The training will begin shortly. All right, hi everyone. Thanks for joining. It's just after 1 o'clock, so we wanted to let everyone kind of introduce themselves really quick before we get started, so everyone will feel more comfortable going down the training later and asking more questions. I'm Sharon with the Idaho Department of Commerce, for those of you that haven't met me yet. I'll give more introduction later. Sarah, go ahead with yours.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarah Mata with the Idaho State Department of Agriculture. And for introductions, to kind of keep this simple and keep everyone from kind of going on top of each other, I'll just go down through and call out names off of the list. And if you don't mind, just make sure you're unmuted. And it'd be great if you have your cam on and just share your name and who you're with. That'd be just fine. So let's start with, go ahead, let's have Tina give her introduction.
Hi everybody, I'm Tina Salisbury. I'm with the Idaho Department of Commerce. Thanks for coming today.
Alan Howell.
I'm Alan Howell. I'm here under two guises here, if you'll excuse me. I'm with SBDC, Idaho SBDC out of Idaho Falls. And also we have a company called Andy Specialties my wife and I own and run, and we export. So anyway, thank you.
Andrea.
Hi, Andrea Velasquez-San with the Idaho Department of Commerce International. I have sectors of aerospace and advanced manufacturing and technology.
Awesome. Elizabeth? Elizabeth's.
Elizabeth, if you're there, I've unmuted you.
Oh, actually. Okay, well, that's okay. Well, I see Corey Marshall just joined, so we'll have Corey, do you want to do a quick introduction to share your name and who you're with?
Sure. Hi guys, Corey Marshall here. I'm with Mill 95 out of Idaho. We contract and manufacture hops for the brewing industry and sell those hops domestically and export to other markets as well.
Awesome. All right, Elizabeth? She's available. Okay, let's go ahead and go on to Gary.
Yeah, I'm Gary Zoig. I'm here with Tana Crow. We're both with Aviation Specialties Unlimited out of Boise over here by the airport, and we do night vision for aircraft.
Awesome. Irene?
Hi there, Irene Gonzalez with the Small Business Administration in Boise.
Jake?
Hi, good afternoon. Jay Park from the U.S. Commercial Service in Boise, Idaho. I work with Amy, Benson, and Tina. Thank you very much.
Jake Reynolds? All right, how about Jennifer Burden?
Good afternoon, everybody. Jennifer Verdon with the Idaho Department of Commerce with the international team. And thank you for everybody who hopped on and is learning logistics for the third webinar for the Expo Fundamentals series.
Yeah. Karen?
Hi, I'm Karen Appelgren. I'm the program manager for the Business Retention and Expansion Unit at Idaho Commerce.
And Keelan? Hopefully I said that right. Okay, let's go on to Keith.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Keith Pettyjohn. I'm a district sales executive for Expeditors International here in Boise. Been in Boise for a long time, and nice to see some familiar faces and to see some new faces. We appreciate the invitation from Sarah to be the presenters this afternoon. And I've asked my colleague Michael Rice, who's our ocean export manager up in Seattle, to support in that effort.
Awesome. Laura.
Good afternoon. I'm Laura Johnson with the Idaho State Department of Agriculture, also in our international marketing team.
Marie.
Hi, Marie Baker. I'm with the Idaho Small Business Development Center, and I am at the Nampa Accelerator.
Right. Martin.
Hi, excuse me. Hi, I'm Martin. I'm on here on behalf of Cast Touring, and we make ski bindings here in Driggs, Idaho.
Hey, Michael Rice.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michael Rice. As Keith mentioned earlier, I'm the Ocean Export Manager for Expeditors in Seattle, and we oversee, I guess the Seattle territory for Expeditors oversees Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Alaska. So quite a few accounts in your area that I'm excited to have the opportunity today. You know, I love what I do in talking logistics, and most people at cocktail parties don't enjoy that nearly as much as hopefully the seminar will be. So excited to have an opportunity to share with you.
Great. Ricardo.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Ricardo Bessel from Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and we are manufacturers of small lavender processors and harvester. And we have a customer interested in other countries, especially in Australia and New Zealand, and that is our market that we are trying to open now.
Great, I'm glad you're here. Sarah.
Hi, my name is Sarah Massey, and I am president and owner of S. Massey Consulting, which is an export compliance and training company.
Todd?
Hi, everybody. This is Todd English with Riverence Provisions. We are a trout and steelhead farmer and producer in just outside of Twin Falls. So we have yet to export, but we are super excited to learn as much as we can. And we're hoping to get an export in 2021 under our belts, thanks to your help. Thank you.
Awesome. Trish?
Hi, everyone. I'm Trish McCarthy. I'm with Impello Global Services. We are a broker, insurance broker of export credit insurance with Ex-Im Bank and other private sector insurers. I'm here in Boise. It's nice to see everyone.
Great. And Will Ricks? All right, was there anybody who got skipped or didn't get to do an introduction that wants to do one real quick?
Sarah, it looks like we had Kristen join us.
Okay.
Hi, yes, thank you. I'm a little late joining. I'm Kristen Powell McCleskey. I work with Banner Bank. I manage their trade finance department out of I'm located in Boise.
Great.
Looks like we got everybody.
Awesome.
Okay, perfect. I'm going to go ahead and get started on our presentation here. Everyone can see the screen now. We want to be cognizant of your time, so we'll just get right into it here. Maybe, hang on. Oh, well, hold on. We're having technical difficulties now. Sorry about that. Sarah, talk about something fun. Give me just a sec.
Something fun.
All right.
Well, let's look.
I can talk about something fun. Let me put my camera back on. So I'll just do a quick plug for anybody, companies on the call that are not familiar with our STEP grant, or if you are familiar, just letting everybody know that grant applications are closing on Friday at 3 p.m. Mountain Time. So if you need to know more about it, feel free to message me in the chat and I can give you some scoop. Otherwise, just, quick plugs so that since we had some time and I can throw it out there that we got some money that we want to give away to our awesome Idaho companies.
Oh, that's great. The STEP grant is a great program.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tina. All right, I think we're good to go now. Everyone can see the screen and we're moving. Okay.
Okay.
Here we go.
Hi, everyone. Let me just start off by saying how excited that we are to have so many businesses that are interested in exploring the opportunities of exporting. So if you attended session 1 or 2, then welcome back. And if you're new, then I'm Sarah Mata with the Idaho State Department of Agriculture. I am on the international team as a trade specialist.
All right. And again, my name is Sharon. I'm with the Idaho Department of Commerce on the international team. Both of our teams work with small to medium-sized Idaho companies that are new to exporting or are trying to expand their export business.
Our goal in this session is to help you learn how to pick a freight forwarder, find your product classifications, know what export documentations that you need, logistics options, learn about Incoterms, and know your tariffs and free trade agreements. Our guest speaker today is going to be Michael Rice from Expeditors International, but before he presents, we're going to give you some tips and tricks on how to pick a good freight forwarder.
All right, so the first things you want to think about with a freight forwarder is reputation, experience, what kind of network they have, what services they offer, and their pricing. So you should have all received your handouts in the email yesterday. If you signed up late, I'm sorry, they will be available on our website after this webinar though, and we'll send them out in a follow-up email too if you need. So if everyone wants to pull out those worksheets, we'll kind of go through that first one. So building a good reputation takes years. and it can be destroyed in seconds. For freight forwarders, their reputation and connections are what drives their business. We have a couple of links for you here, one for the WCA or the World Cargo Alliance, and one for freight deadbeats. If you're unable to find any background information on either of those, you can simply ask your freight forwarder for references. This really shouldn't be an issue if they are a reputable forwarder. Likewise, you can also review their financial statements online unless they're a privately held company. When it comes to freight forwarders' experience, there's a few things to be aware of. For example, when dealing with import and export customs, you need to know if your partner has the industry knowledge to navigate laws and regulations in both the country of origin and the country of destination. You also need to think about whether you need to work with a specialist, particularly one that deals with your cargo type. Like the slide says, whether you're exporting perishable goods and require a refrigerated container, or if you're shipping recycled plastics, having a freight forwarder that knows the best practices for transporting your goods is paramount. You want to ensure your freight forwarder has a good network. A freight forwarder's industry's relationships are nothing short of vital. Connections in the shipping industry are the difference between success and failure. These connections are what allow forwarders to leverage better rates, and it also helps them to ensure that paperwork and local authorities can be navigated more efficiently. It's important to know if your freight forwarder can provide the correct document management as well as these third-party logistics services that your products might require. The last thing you want to discover is that your freight forwarder is unable to provide you any of the services specific to your needs. These documents and logistics services listed here are only a fraction of what a freight forwarder can help organize. So it's important that you understand what a potential forwarder can and cannot provide. You also want to choose someone with transparent pricing. Just imagine the scenario: you request a rate quote. It takes 3 days to hear a response. After you book your space, you find out later that the price was higher than initially negotiated. This can be due to a general rate increase or a peak season surcharge. It can also come down to a lack of transparency or pricing structure. You may find that costs are being combined. Freight forwarders can charge things like fuel surcharges, brokerage fees, and they can kind of be combined all in clumps. So find a forwarder with transparent pricing structure that you understand. Number 6, make sure that they offer cargo insurance. After you've found the forwarder with transparent pricing, the third-party logistics services you require, and you have mutual trust, you now need to think about one last thing, and that's the cargo insurance. If you want peace of mind and risk reduction, then it's essential to purchase cargo insurance that provides coverage for loss and damage for your specific type of shipment. You may also need to think about finding a forwarder that can offer specific cargo insurance depending on your shipping needs. Just for some examples of only just in the last, it's only the 16th of December. On December 5th, a cargo ship sprung a leak and sank in the South China Sea. On December 10th, a cargo ship struck a reef in the South China Sea, and another ship on that same day ran aground on Nangang Island in Taiwan. And on December 13th, the container ship was sunk in a collision with another container ship. So it is very important to have your insurance and your freight forwarder that can provide that. A couple other things just to keep in mind when you're looking for a freight forwarder is to understand that they are not legally responsible for delays. A freight forwarder's estimated date of delivery is only a forecast. If delays occur, they are not held accountable. You also want to make sure that you maintain a good relationship with them. You don't want to have your bookings made at the last minute and then asking them to jump through hoops. Sometimes that can happen, and a good freight forwarder will help accommodate that. But generally, you want to keep your bookings in advance to let them have the time they need. You want to expect that complications are part of the shipping industry. Freight forwarders are efficient, but they can't perform miracles. Having a good relationship also includes being able to accept and work through issues. Problems will inevitably arise, and how you communicate in a crisis will determine the future course of your relationship with a freight forwarder. If all else fails, you need to find a new freight forwarder. if your current one is consistently negligent. They're not legally responsible for cargo delays, but you can choose whether or not to continue to work with them if they're unable to make your shipping smooth and are not getting the service you have requested. So we've listed 2 links on here that are good places to start. And once you find a potential forwarder, repeat the first 6 things, and then you can move on from there. So now I'm going to turn it over to our experienced freight forwarder, Michael Rice from Expeditors International.
All right, thank you for that. So what we're gonna go through today is a very high level. A lot of the information contained in this, we would provide normally in a half day or even a full day class. So intentionally, we're going very quickly through the material to try and get as much as we can in. But if you have questions on any of the topics that we cover, I encourage you to reach out to Sharon or Sarah or myself, and we'll gladly get you additional resources to try and help answer any questions that you might have. Go ahead. All right, so as mentioned, I'm the Ocean Export Manager currently with Expeditors in Seattle. I've been with Expeditors for 17 years. I apparently love freight more than most people. I am a licensed customs broker, so what that means is I spend a lot of time painfully studying for an exam so I could sit in a room for 4 hours, and I believe the licensed broker's exam still has a lower pass rate than both the bar exam and the accounting exam. So it's one of the most challenging certifications out there in terms of industry licensing. And myself and both Keith, who's also on the call, are licensed customs brokers. Then I'm also IATA FIATA certified. So IATA FIATA is an international freight forwarding association, and that certification is really focused on managing air cargo. So it's specifically focused on how do you route, what dynamics happen with air cargo. So I've got a wide breadth of industry knowledge. Been doing this for a little bit and excited to walk through it with you. Okay. And for those of you who don't know about Expeditors, go ahead and go to the next one. So Expeditors was founded in 1979. We are headquartered globally here in Seattle, Washington. I think we're close to 18,000 employees. It keeps going up and down, especially with fun things like COVID going on. And last year we did about $8 billion in revenue. So we're on the Fortune 500 list. But we don't own any assets. So we're non-asset based and we don't advertise. So oftentimes a lot of people who are outside of the freight forwarding industry may not know who we are. We have offices in 179 countries. And one of the things that we've done as a company to really support the network that Sharon was talking about earlier is every one of our offices worldwide, we didn't send someone out to go develop. We actually developed them locally. So all of our offices are run locally by people who are familiar with the laws and the organizations within those countries. And the idea was that if we kind of had local knowledge that knew how to interact with the local governments, we'd have a much better way to get cargo moving throughout the world. Because every country is different and every country has unique aspects to how you have to kind of address certain things with a cargo. And so it's really important that just because you have cargo going, say from the United States to Europe, things may be different if you need to take it to South America, as an example, and significantly more complicated in those types of situations. All right, so what is trade? Trade in general is something that facilitates global commerce. And so when we talk about trade, we don't only talk about the parties involved in the trade, we also talk about transferring of money, data, information, and risk. And that's going to lead us into kind of Incoterms. But when we look at the party, we think about how many people are possibly involved in the trade. And so one of the things that we like to ask is, when you guys think about the number of parties who touch your cargo as you move it internationally, how many people do you think are possibly involved in the supply chain? Anybody want to hazard a guess? All right. Very talkative. So we'll go ahead and guess that there are 15 possible parties involved in your supply chain. So if you go ahead and hit the animation, Sharon. So a lot of times when we think about international trade, we really are thinking about the person who's selling the product and the person who's purchasing the product. We don't think about all of the different parties involved. And when you start thinking about the trucker who's got to pick up the cargo, possibly a factory that's producing it, the various points it gets transferred, we can identify up to 15 potential people that are involved in trade. Over that, right, not only are we moving a product, there's documents that are being shared between all those parties. There's different levels of information as freight progresses through the system, right? Where's it at? Is it on the vessel? Has the vessel left? What time is the vessel going to arrive? Did something happen to the vessel? And then once the freight is actually moving, the other big question is, when do I pay, right? So from a buyer's perspective, you want to pay as far out as possible. And from a purchaser perspective, from a seller's perspective, you want that money as quickly as you can get it. And so the transfer of money is a really, really important thing to consider when you're talking about international trade. And not only is the transfer of money, but the transfer of risk is also associated. And in the international trade world, risk and money don't always transfer at the same time. And a lot of that has to do with what we call Incoterms, and we'll get there. But it's a really important thing, especially as you get a longer supply chain, or you look at options like ocean, where it takes a longer time to get freight from one place to the next. And there's different mediums like letters of credit to protect people through the process. But it is absolutely, aside from just figuring out how to get your freight there, probably the most important thing that you need to think about when you're agreeing to terms with your customers or possible relationships you have internationally. So some key things that we like to go through terminology-wise, we like to joke that we often talk in our own language. So shipper, pretty easy one. So that's the person who is ultimately tendering us the goods for transportation. The shipper is not necessarily always the owner of the goods. The consignee is the party who is going to be receiving the goods. It's the kind of the party that's on the bill of lading and will be consigned to once it arrives. Most of the time it's the buyer, but not always. Then you have a freight forwarder, somebody like Expeditors, who our job is to kind of facilitate that transaction for you, help reach across borders, make sure that you're interacting with government agencies in the right way. And so we're really doing a lot of the coordination for you. The easy term I use with my friends is we're like a travel agent for your cargo. And so we're trying to help facilitate all the pieces of the transaction for you. So we work with air, ocean, and ground carriers. So these are people who, from a commercial business standpoint, have decided to invest in assets that will actually take the cargo from point A to point B. And then you have common carrier. So this is more of an industry term, but it's any carrier that's engaged in transportation with published rates. So you have asset carriers, and then you have common carriers. And so Expeditors could be seen as a common carrier if we're selling asset carrier services on their behalf. And so it's a more broad encompassing term. So freight forwarders generally are considered a common carrier because we're publishing rates that we're then selling to other people. Go ahead next. You also have a fun term called the non-vessel operating common carrier. So in the United States specifically, we are a regulated ocean market by the Federal Maritime Commission. And we have the opportunity, and other countries worldwide have this, where as a non-vessel operating common carrier, meaning we can act like we own shipping vessels and actually sell services on vessel space, but we have to comply with the FMC maritime laws. And so it's a broad term that basically identifies anybody who's acting in the ocean world, but doesn't actually own an ocean vessel. And there are very few people who actually own ocean vessels. So most people you're interacting with in this world are probably NVOCCs. Then you have integrators. So an integrator is a company that provides door-to-door freight service, but not necessarily kind of your FedExes or UPSs. This is really more of your main worldwide airlines. So Lufthansa or Delta. So these companies, maybe they have freight that's coming into Seattle or Boise, but they don't actually have a flight coming into Seattle or Boise. It's what they're doing is they're bringing it into a port like LA, they're putting on a truck. It's still on an airway bill, even though it's moving on truck to LA. And so we consider that integrated service because you bought it from, whether it's Boise to Shanghai or Shanghai to Boise, and it may be all moved on an air service, but it doesn't always move on an air mode, if that makes sense. And then a 3PL is a third-party logistics provider. And so these are companies that are similar to freight forwarders, but the term freight forwarder kind of grew into 3PL as additional services, be it insurance, be it more data technology, have really come into the industry. And so freight forwarders, a lot of them have evolved to where they're doing a lot more management of the transportation other than just facilitating documents and transactions. It's a much more evolved service as a 3PL. All right, go to the next slide, please. All right, so a couple more terms. So a bill of lading. So this is the document that is, bill of lading is the term that we use to cover all the various industries or types of shipping. Each one has their own version of a bill of lading and has a slightly different name. But at the end of the day, the bill of lading is what's telling us who the cargo is from, where the cargo is going, who's responsible for it, and who is taking it where. And so at some levels, the bill of lading can actually become the contract and the ownership of the cargo. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Okay. Then you have house bills of lading. So house bill of lading is generally something issued only by freight forwarders. And so the freight forwarder, because they're acting as an intermediary and they're buying and selling space on other people's assets, they issue their own bill of lading. And what's really important about that is the house bill of lading will have different terms than the actual bill of lading. And so something to be aware of is you need to identify if there's any gaps possibly between the coverage that you might have with a bill of lading versus the coverage that exists on a house bill of lading to ensure that your cargo is protected in the event of an unexpected circumstance. The master bill of lading. So this is generally, again, in a freight forwarder scenario, a master bill of lading is between the freight forwarder and the actual carrier of the goods. So using Delta Airlines as an example, so if Expeditors and Delta Airline had an agreement to move cargo from LA to Shanghai, and then Expeditors contracted with your company, you would get a house bill that says you're going from Boise to Shanghai. Expeditors would issue a master bill between ourselves and the carrier. And so there would be two documents covering your freight. And the difference is that as a freight forwarder, we actually will take multiple shippers and multiple house bills and put them on one master bill. And so it's a way for us to kind of leverage the third party position that we're in by having multiple parties to a transaction and really getting the advantage of buying bulk space with the larger carrier groups. And it's a win-win because we can buy it at a lower rate than you could buy it directly. And then we can sell it to you in a way that makes money, and we can guarantee to the carriers that we'll fill their space. And so the third-party freight forwarder is one of the few middlemen that is a truly beneficial relationship for everybody. Go ahead. And then FAK, freight all kinds, it's a universal term that basically says if we don't have a specific declaration for your freight, we're just going to call it freight all kinds. And that's going to say that regardless of what type of freight it is, it's covered. And the last one is landed cost. So this is a really important term as you're looking at how to factor in the cost of your cargo. And so the question is, if you're moving it from, again, let's just say Boise to Shanghai, what is the cost of that? So you may have an air freight or an ocean freight cost, but does that include your customs cost, the duty cost, the cost of all the paperwork? There's a lot of other pieces of that transaction that go in. And when we talk about that in our world, we talk about that as the landed cost. And that means if you take the total cost of moving everything and divide it by the number of products you moved, we can give you a total cost to go from Boise to Shanghai per product that you. And then the last one is, it's really important, especially because internationally, so much cargo is moved in a bulk environment, that you have an awareness of hazardous material and dangerous material regulations, because there are articles that can't move together. And so one of your responsibilities as the shipper is to ensure that you identify that appropriately for your freight forwarder so that they can then make the right decisions moving forward. All right. So once you kind of get into the overall dynamics, there are some really key documents that any freight forwarder is going to be asking for. The first and probably most important document is the commercial invoice. The commercial invoice, as far as international trade is concerned, is probably the most important document that's out there. It identifies the parties of the transaction, it identifies the cost of the transaction, And from a financial standpoint, it identifies to governments worldwide how to assess their taxes. And, as we all know, taxes are really important, and therefore that's the document that must be perfect when you're moving into a transaction. The second most important document is actually not the packing list. It's the bill of lading. So the bill of lading then becomes the contract between the owner of the goods and everybody that's moving them. And so this may be an airway bill, it may be an ocean bill of lading, it may be a truck bill of lading, aka a contract of carriage. But the commercial invoice and the bill of lading need to have similar information, or else government entities will cause a kink in the process. So one of the things that a good freight forwarder is going to do is they're going to review your documents before the transaction gets started to make sure that your commercial invoice and your bill of lading are saying the same things. And if not, they'll work with you to correct it. So a couple other documents that are important, and probably more common, there are a lot of other documents, but the packing list. So some countries require packing lists, some do not, but it helps kind of identify the materials of each package. It helps customs officials verify cargo counts, but it also helps to identify the materials that things are packed in. And so a lot of times when you're looking at importing cargo, the way that the costs of importing are assessed, if you have a very accurate packing list, you can actually pay less because the cost of your packing materials is generally reduced. And so there is value in putting an accurate packing list together. The other thing it does is if there are any questions on where's the cargo, it may help you identify what's missing. And so if you have somebody looking around a warehouse and they don't know how many boxes to look for, it's really hard to find that missing cargo. But if there's a very clear description of it's a 20 by 20 by 20 crate, it's much easier for somebody to find that missing cargo. And then the last one is a certificate of origin. So certificates of origins are generally commodity specific or country specific. And so especially in the agricultural world, there's a lot of certificate of origin requirements. But if you are looking to export to certain countries, they may say, hey, we need you to identify that this is in fact a good of the United States. Sometimes that applies to free trade agreements, which may allow you to get reduced duty rates, but it may also allow countries to identify goods that, based on tariff rate reasons, have different costs associated with the importation of those. Next. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is Incoterms. And Incoterms is a short phrase that stands for International Commercial Terms. And International Commercial Terms are, they're published by the International Chamber of Commerce. That intention of them is to avoid misunderstanding of kind of the relationship of moving freight. However, a lot of people misuse and misunderstand the terms. And what doesn't help the situation is the terms are updated every 5 to 10 years. And when they update them, they make slight tweaks. And so somebody who maybe started shipping in 2010 is really familiar with Incoterms 2010 because that's what they learned when they started and they've used them for 10 years. And then all of a sudden Incoterms 2020 comes along and there's some slight changes and they might use terms like DDU, which doesn't exist anymore, but that's still the term. And so one of the things that's really important is to not just rely on the Incoterm, which is designed to help facilitate the discussion, but also make sure that the contract language that you have represents the agreement that you want. Because at the end of the day, regardless of what your documents say from an Incoterm standpoint, if there is a dispute, it's going to go back to the actual purchase agreement contract. And so I just want to caution as we go into this that these are really, really helpful to clarify, but they are not the final word. The final word will always go back to the purchasing agreement that you have with your customer. Okay, go next. So like I said, there are 11 terms. We'll go to the next one, Sharon. We're going to focus on the 5 most common. And the way that we kind of do this, and I believe you guys have a handout of it, is we use a little chart that shows the way that kind of transportation obligations, the cost of the goods, and then the risk of the goods are transferred. So we'll go to the first one, which is kind of the start of the process. Very, very common, and it's ex works. So the question is, if we have some goods and they are leaving, it's an ex works terms, what's happened? So go ahead and hit the animation. So from a carriage, meaning the goods, the person who produced the goods is only responsible to making them ready for pickup. However, the person who is purchasing the goods is responsible for arranging the truck to go all the way back to the factory, which is this one on the far left there, and pick them up. So this is kind of your in-store pickup that we have going on with COVID-19, right? So you order it online, but it's your job to go to the store and pick it up. The risk associated with this, meaning if something happens to it, the moment you take that package away from that factory, the factory is no longer responsible for it. They're going to say, nope, you signed off on it as a clean box. We're no longer responsible for what happens. You get in a car accident on the way home or something happens to the truck, that risk is not on the seller of the goods, it's on the person who purchased it. The next one. And the last one is the cost. So the person who pays for all of that is going to be the person who purchased it. So this is one side of the spectrum, X Works, that basically says, we'll make it available for you, but once you pick it up, it's all on the purchaser of the goods. Go ahead and go next. So a very common term that is used often is free on board. Technically, free on board is an ocean term. It is used in many different, commonly people use it for air, they use it for multiple modes. And there are corresponding Incoterms for the modes that are similar to this, but we're just going to focus on free on board for now because it's common. And so what this is saying is basically that the seller is going to be responsible for the goods all the way to the point where they get on the vessel. So we're going to arrange for the truck to pick it up. We're going to arrange it all the way to the door at the airport or the port. And then once it gets there, we'll turn it over to the vessel or the air carrier, and then it's no longer our responsibility. And so the air freight or the ocean freight would be paid by the buyer in this scenario. However, the trucking from the factory door to the carrier would be paid for by the seller. The next one. So similarly, the risk of loss transfers at the same time. So in this scenario, if the truck picked up the cargo from the factory, was on its way to the airport or the ocean port and got into an accident, that risk is still on the factory. Despite the fact it's left, based on the Incoterm, they would need to replace that. It doesn't switch possession, for lack of a better term, until it gets checked in with the carrier that's going to be moving it. The last one is kind of the financial costs. So similar to the last term, all the costs are kind of paid by the parties that are responsible for them. And so the seller is going to get it all the way to the airport and turn it over. They'll pay for the trucking, they'll pay for the manufacturing, they'll pay all those pieces. And generally in this example, they're also paying for the export documentation costs. So they're going to file an EEI with the US government. They're going to make sure that any charges to get POAs or shipper letter of instructions will all be done by the shipper in this example. Okay. All right, cost, insurance, and freight. So as we move further down the line, so this is now we've pushed it a little bit further. And so from a buyer's perspective, this is a really nice way to purchase because the risk doesn't transfer until it gets much closer to you. From a seller's perspective, this might give you a little more ability to control prices on things depending on the volumes that you move. But so now the seller is actually responsible for the international transportation leg of the journey. So from the moment it's kind of built all the way to the arrival at destination, the seller is responsible for facilitating that. What they're generally not doing is they're not doing the importation into the term. And so in this scenario, the importer would have their own customs broker, they'd have their own truckers to do delivery and all that stuff. And so the CIF term stops basically when the vessel or the airplane arrives at the final port of delivery in the the importing country. Similarly to that, from a risk standpoint, risk actually transfers a little bit earlier in this one. And so this is the C terms are the first terms where the carriage responsibility, but the risks are different. And so in this scenario, even though the cost of moving it and the responsibility for kind of facilitating that doesn't stop until it arrives at port, the risk actually stops once it's put on the plane or the ocean vessel. So in this scenario, if something happened to the vessel, once it's on the vessel, the shipper has kind of stepped away from their responsibility and the risk is now on the buyer. And so if something happened, the it once it's on them. Okay, next. And then from a standpoint, Generally, the buyer is paying for the transportation costs up to the port of arrival. Again, and then the importer is paying for the import brokerage, duties, VATs, those types of things. All right, so DAP is one of the new terms that has come along in more recent Incoterms. And it was intended to help clarify and replace the delivered duty unpaid term. It's a little bit more tricky because since it's at a named place, it really depends on where that named place is. And you could use this a few different ways. So you could use it very similarly to a CIF term, and you could say DAP port of import, which would look very similar to the CIF term, only you would have responsibility for all three sections, the carriage, the risk, and the costs to the point of import. And I would say that this is probably one of the more common terms. So Ex Works is very common and DAP is very common. If the named place is beyond the port of import, so DAP at the customer's door, then the responsibility actually extends beyond the port of import. And so the named place is a really important thing on this particular term. So from a transportation standpoint, you're delivering up to the named place, which could be, and most often is the customer's door. The risk of loss or damage is yours until you turn it over. And so if something happens to it, you as the shipper, we're going to be responsible for that. And then from a cost standpoint, you're generally paying all the costs all the way through there. Because delivered duty unpaid is no longer a term, oftentimes DAP terms are used to have the seller facilitate the transportation all the way to point of delivery, but still allow the importer to use their own broker. So in those scenarios, what's happening is the freight forwarder, once it arrives in this one, it says Buckingham Palace, so say London, the freight forwarder turns it over to the customs broker that's identified by the buyer. That customs broker facilitates the customs transaction, gets the release from UK customs, and then turns it back over to the freight forwarder, and the freight forwarder then delivers it to the final point. Right? And we'll go to the last one. And so Ex Works was kind of everything pushed to the left, meaning that the seller had the least amount of responsibility. DDP, which is delivered duty paid, this is all the way to the right. So all of the carriage, all of the cost, and all of the risk are the responsibility of the seller in this. So I like to call this is the Amazon, right? So if you're going to purchase something from Amazon, you expect that they're going to take care of everything with whatever you paid all the way up to your door. And if it shows up at your door and it's damaged, you're going to call Amazon and you expect them to replace it. So this is the freight forwarding equivalent of that same thing. And so if there's any concerns about what happened in a DDP world, this goes on the seller. The benefit of a buyer is the buyer doesn't get the risk until it arrives, right? So that's why we really like Amazon, because we can get it. We don't have to worry about it until it gets there. We don't have to figure out how to get the weird sized chair into our car. It just works. Whereas the negative of this for the buyer is all of those costs for the transportation, the risk, that has to be built into the sales price. And so Ex Works is somebody who feels like they can buy better, so they want to pay the lowest price for the good. And somebody who wants maybe ease of transportation is going to buy it in the DDP world. And then depending on other arrangements, you can have everything in between. Go ahead and go to the next one, Sharon. And so again, we went super quickly through those. And there are 11 different terms. So all of these are here. They're all on your list. And you can see that they're kind of grouped by style. So Ex Works is by itself. It's an E term. Then you have your F term, which is free carrier alongside, which is what the A stands for. And that's really your air term. And then FOB is the same thing for an ocean port. And then you have your C terms, which is focused really on the cost and freight. CIF has the insurance. And then you have your D terms, which is DAP, DPU, and DDP. But if you look at the first letter of the terms, they're all very similar in who pays the risk, the cost, and has the carriage responsibilities. Go to the next one. I think we have a little quiz. Oh, sorry. So with 2020 specifically, we talked about this a little bit. All the 2020 terms are intended to have a named place at the end of them. And so one of the things that is really encouraged to help clarify is say that this is the term and this is the place of transfer. And so if you say this is going to be FOB at the Port of Seattle or FOB the Port of LA, FOB whatever it may be, that helps protect you in your transaction because you're giving a very clear instruction where the transfers are occurring within those three avenues. And so some examples of those would be FCA London. So free carrier side in London, FCA London Terminal. And so the difference there is in London, it's a little ambiguous because it could be anytime it hits London as a city, but whereas the London Terminal is very specific, it says this is going to transfer once it's in the London Terminal. And then even more specific to that, if you wanted to get to a very exact spot, you could say FCA Lufthansa Terminal at the Heathrow Airport. And so that gives like, hey, at this exact point, that's where it's going to happen. And so depending on your relationship and your concern, the more defined you get, the more specific it can be defined if a risk does occur. All right. So we're going to take we have two test questions. So in this scenario, crazily enough, these huge vessels do have issues. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But so the freight's damaged, it falls off the boat at port of destination. We used a CIF term. Who's responsible for this?
The seller.
The seller. So CIF, the seller is going to be responsible for replacing the cargo if it falls off at the port of destination. So I would actually say, I believe it's the purchaser. So the transfer in a CIF would, once it's arrived, since it fell off at the port of destination, the transfer
just at the port.
If it fell off in the water before it ever made it to the port, right? You could argue it would be the other way. Okay, go to the next one. One more. All right, so here, the goods are still at the seller's facility. It's an ex-works term, and there was an accident. Who's responsible this time? That's it.
Seller.
The seller, that's right. So in this situation, the way they're terming it, it never left the facility. And so since it's still within the facility, the transfer hasn't occurred, the seller is responsible for that. So good job on those. There's tons of information on Incoterms. You know, people like ourselves are happy to come and whether it's one-on-one or we actually do full Incoterms seminars that really allow you to talk through examples and see those. Hopefully the chart that you have is helpful, but please ask questions as you need. And I think we have some time at the end that we can help clarify if there's any questions. All right, Schedule B numbers. So go ahead and go to the next slide. So as an exporter, we are expected under the 15 Code of Federal Regulations, 30.6, provide multiple data elements to the government before we have our transactions depart. And I know that in one of the other seminars, I think some of this was covered, and I believe in the next seminar, some more export compliance is being reviewed. But one of the ones we want to talk about today was the commodity classification of the Schedule B number. So the Schedule B number is a harmonized number. Go ahead and go to the next one. And so the harmonized system, and this is where it gets a little confusing as an exporter, especially if you're doing importing as well. So the harmonized system is something that's actually administrated by the World's Customs Organization. So anybody from a country standpoint that's part of the WCO or the WTO is generally using the harmonized system. The misunderstanding, though, is the harmonized system is actually only harmonized to 6 digits. And so anything after 6 digits of a code is harmonized specifically for a country. So in the US, we generally have a 10-digit importation code, right, our HTS number. And those last 4 digits are specific to the US that allow the US to classify it further than the WCO. However, while the HTS is a really good start, it is not something that can just be used for exports. One of the reasons is our wonderful design of our system from a government standpoint. We decided to have 2 different bodies regulate the 2 different moves of import and export transactions. So when we import into the US, the HTS is kind of overseen by the US Customs, which is now part of the Department of Homeland Security. Exporting, however, is actually overseen by the US Census Bureau. The Homeland Security does have a voice in exporting, but they're not who kind of maintains the data. That's done by the Census Bureau. So the Census Bureau has Schedule B, and the US Customs has a HTS. And so they're going to be similar for the first 6, but after the first 6, they have the ability to go different directions. And Schedule B numbers are revised once a year. And you would think that products couldn't change that much every year, but amazingly, we get quite a few updates every year on both the Schedule B list as well as HTS codes. And so it's important to be familiar with not only your product, but your product classifications, because for whatever reason, they like to change how they're looking at them and how they want to identify and sub-identify things. Let's go to the next one. And so Schedule B, the nice thing in kind of our day and age is you don't have to have the books that are, kind of a ruler thick to sort through and figure all this stuff. And so the US Census Bureau has this great website. I believe this will get sent out, but if not, jot down the URL there. But you can actually go in there, you can look through it. If you want to go page by page, you actually can do some searching, which is one of the better tools that they have within Schedule B. And so you can search for something and say, I think it's called this. And the recommendation that we give to most people is start with a very common name for it. And so in the example we have up here, we'd say, okay, you want to search for, you're making a pen. So very simply type in their pen, right? And so if you look at the description on 96.08, which is the first 4 digits, it's telling you that here's all the different types of pens that are included under this heading. And so if you know that what you have is a pen and you see that it's included in that description, you're in a pretty good territory. And so somewhere in that 9608 is going to be what you're looking for. And as you break down and you see something that says ballpoint pens, now all of a sudden you have the classification that you need for the US export. The other thing that's really important, if you look on the far right of that, it has UOM or unit of measure. So when we're filing our export declaration with US Customs, we have to provide them a unit of measure for your goods. Sometimes that's a weight, which is, sometimes it's a quantity, which from a gross standpoint was a gross quantity of pens. Sometimes it's a value. And so depending on your product, the kind of important point that the government is tracking can change. So it's really important to know what your unit of measure it is, so you can provide that to your freight forwarder. It'll help ensure that they're not coming back asking you questions along the way. And then again, to reiterate, the Schedule B is just for export usage. So again, kind of solidifying here, the HTS and Schedule B are similar, but they're not the same. They're both based on the WCO harmonized system. They're both 10 digits, right? We made this as confusing as possible as a country. The HTS system within the US, that's how we identify our duty rates. That's how we're getting statistical information on import goods. It's also how we're assessing duty from a tax standpoint. So at the US, we don't tax things that are exported. We only tax them that are imported. So we also, there's a notice to exporters. There's a small list of HTS codes that are not valid for export shipments. It's just a way for them to kind of maintain some reporting data. And on the export side, it's all maintained by the US Census Bureau. So if you have an HTS, generally you can find your Schedule B, but please note they're not the same thing. You can't just take it off the commercial invoice of what was sent to you and use it if you're going to be reselling a similar product. All right, so some other things, again, I know there's some other seminars related to this, but it's really important that as the exporter, you're responsible for the classification, you're responsible for your export control compliance number, your ECCN. You're responsible for identifying if there's a license determination and if there's any exceptions that are discovered along the way. So the US government, the way they look at things, freight forwarders have a version of responsibility, but ultimately, based on something called the Modernization Act that occurred in 1993, the US exporter, the US importer are ultimately held responsible for their transactions. And so just because you're using a third-party freight forwarder, it doesn't mean that you can rely on their expertise and not have the responsibility of making sure that the data is correct. And that's a really important thing for you to know as you're kind of engaging in those transactions. And so we want to just make sure that we call that out because we're not covering them today, but they are very, very important to the transaction. All right, so all of that information then is going to be put together on documents. And one of the documents that's very common in our world is called the shipper's letter of instruction. So what this does is it takes a lot of the pieces of information we've talked about. It gives us who the shipper is. It tells us who the consignees are. It tells us, is it a routed or non-routed transaction? It tells us if there's dangerous goods. It provides us for special instructions. It gives us the commodity, the Schedule B number. So it gives us a ton of information on how we should handle your cargo for you. But the other thing that they do is it actually provides us with a power of attorney. So when we're doing an export declaration for you to the U.S. Customs, the U.S. Census Bureau, we're actually acting on your behalf. And so the shipper's letter of instruction is giving us the single power of attorney that allows us to handle all those transactions for you. And a lot of that will then transfer over to the bill of lading. The one thing to remember, and I think this was discussed earlier, just because we have your power of attorney doesn't mean that we're taking on all the responsibility. Those responsibilities are going to be identified out based on our bills of lading. And so our bills of lading, we may issue an express bill of lading, which basically means there is no legal requirement to present bill of lading at time of receipt, or we could present original bill of lading. And in the transportation world, if original bills of lading are issued, they actually become the ownership document for the freight. And so in order to get the freight, regardless of where it is in the process, you must have all original copies of the bills of lading in order to take possession. And so whether it's a destination or origin, in order to get that freight back, that's something you have to be in possession of. And so having kind of a clear understanding with your forwarder on what type of documentation is being used is going to be key on how you facilitate your transaction. And the benefit of an original bill of lading is it allows you to have some control over when the cargo is released without having to go down the path of a letter of credit. And so a letter of credit can protect you because you have a third party there. An original bill of lading can protect you. You can actually maintain possession of the bill of lading until your buyer facilitates whatever side of that transaction they need. And then you can give the bills of lading to the buyer so that they can get those goods. So that's the intention of what original bill of ladings are for. Go next. So similar, we wanted to show an airway bill. So this is something that's very common. But one of the things that is important is within the transportation world, we have this concept of what's called gross weight. And gross weight is generally what the actual, if you put it on a scale, what does it weigh? But you also have something called chargeable weight or dimensional weight. And so dimensional weight means, and the easiest example we always use is pillows. So pillows don't physically weigh very much, but they take up a lot of space. And so there are factors that are used, and it's something that'll be agreed upon between yourself and your freight forwarder that say, based on the volume of your cargo, we're going to assign a chargeable weight. And generally, you will be charged the greater of the two. And so if you have pillows, you're actually going to be paying more than they would say on a scale for the volume of that shipment. But if you have bowling balls, being our other favorite example, you're going to pay the actual weight, most likely, of the bowling balls. And so it's something to really dig into with your freight forwarder to understand how they're doing that equation, because different forwarders offer different equations, which could change the way that you're priced. All right, go to the next one. Did I lose Sharon?
Yeah.
All right, there we go. So some things that are going on now is in the ocean world, we've got a lot of different freight sizes. And so as we're talking about shipping and exporting, we really like to just give some visual abilities to kind of the equipment that's being used in the market. And so when container shipping first started, early container ships at the top there, an early container ship could hold 500 to 800 TEU. TEU stands for a 20-foot equivalent unit, which is how all things are measured in the ocean world. Most equipment today is moved as a 40-foot equivalent. So it takes 2 TEUs to equal 1 40-foot. And a 40-foot, in my mind, is the size of a truck, right? So early on, they had about 250 to 400 trucks per vessel, or 500 to 800 TEUs. Today, in our world, and this slide is actually a little bit out of date, I think the largest ocean vessels that are on the market now has 23,000 TEU capacity. And so if you think about that, we've gone from where we could hold 250 trucks on a vessel to today we're holding 12 to 15,000 trucks worth of freight on an ocean vessel. It just creates a vastly different world in terms of risks and liabilities, but also just in the ability to offer things. And one of the best things that's happened as those vessels have gotten bigger is the cost of doing transportation has decreased. And so the ability to kind of reach throughout the world as capacity increases is that it actually decreases the cost of doing that business. Similar on the next slide, you'll see that something that's going on in our world, if you do any importing, you're aware of it, is trying to get into the United States is a huge challenge right now because of the high volume of freight coming from Asia. And so our port infrastructure has really been challenged and hasn't grown that much since kind of the dawn of the port development. And so in a normal time, you see that on the left there, you kind of have an equal balance of import and exports. And so there's a good flow through the terminal. And as things become more congested, obviously import freight's got to get off the vessel so the vessel can keep moving. And the way that those are generally managed at the terminals is export freight gets pushed out, and all of a sudden it's a little bit harder for the export transaction to occur because there's less space for exports, which means the window from when the freight arrives to when the freight leaves gets reduced because they can't store it at the port. In our current world, if you hit the last one there, Sharon, there is so much import cargo that there's almost no export space. In addition to that, the rotation of vessels, because things are so congested, we're not exporting on time. And so one of the things Sharon said early on when you're looking at your freight forwarder is, what additional cost could there be in the market? And one of the challenges that exists right now is that for an exporter is you may have a container arrive in the port of Seattle to depart, let's say, tomorrow. And so everything's on time. But if that vessel isn't going to leave LA because it got caught in congestion, is not going to arrive until next week, as an exporter, you're on the hook for additional charges to pay for the storage of that container in the market until that vessel arrives. And it's a very, very challenging dynamic of the export world that exists right now because the timing isn't under any of our control. But it is something to be aware of that, talking with your exporter and your freight forwarder of how are we going to deal with this in the market conditions will allow you to have, again, no surprises and kind of just a better trade relationship throughout the whole process. The next slide. One more. So the other thing that we like to share is, back one, sorry. From an air freight standpoint, a lot of people don't think about air freight moves in cargo aircraft. So the picture up there, the first picture is a cargo aircraft. The entire plane is dedicated to moving cargo. We look at FedEx planes in the sky, the Amazon Air, that's what these are. They're cargo aircraft. However, over 90% of the freight worldwide is actually moving in passenger aircraft. And so one of the other dynamics that we have with COVID coming into play is the fact that with less passenger travel, there's less air freight capacity as well. And so typically what you'll see is on the belly of the aircraft, you have kind of where we typically believe our luggage is going. That's where cargo is being stored. And then passengers are riding above that. What's been interesting this year is because so much of the air freight capacity is passenger aircraft, we've actually seen passenger flights, and I don't know if anyone else has seen pictures outside of us freight forwarders, they actually will put cargo on top of seats in order to get things like PPE moved because the equipment available for that allows them to move more even though passengers aren't moving. So it's been a really interesting world. But it's important to know that if you are moving air cargo, it's most likely going to move in a passenger aircraft, and that's where the most competitive rates are. But it also emphasizes why it's important to be really clear on if you have any dangerous or hazardous materials, because if something were to go sideways, it could put people's lives at risk. And that's one of the reasons that we, as freight forwarders, are so focused on what is your good and are there any risks associated with it. Let's go to the next. So that being said, so one of the things that's really important to realize is that even though you'll have an agreement with your freight forwarder and they'll have an agreement with the carrier, there are legal liabilities that freight forwarders and carriers are responsible for, but it's a very, very limited aspect compared to your cargo. So there's couple of slides here. So in this example, if you moved a $50,000 shipment weighing 100 pounds, which, you think about electronics and some of those things. I think somebody said they do like night vision for aircraft. My guess is it doesn't take a lot of cargo to get up to $50,000 value, right? Weight-wise, you're not going to get very far. So go ahead and go to the next. So the question is, how much are you responsible in the various modes? So in ocean, you're only responsible, or I would, as a freight forwarder, I'm only responsible to pay you $500 for that. An air carrier, they have a slightly different calculation. It's only $1,300. A trucker is only $50. A warehouse is only $50. And a UPS or a FedEx, a small parcel carrier, is only $100. So if you don't have some type of insurance coverage to help you with this and something happens, you have a huge risk in the ability to cover the loss. Go ahead and go to the next one. And even with those liabilities that I showed you, there's a lot of different ways that carriers have kind of in just the natural contract language to get out of them. Acts of nature, acts of war, so fish and packaging. The way that it's always kind of been described to me is back in the origination of wooden ships and wooden vessels, the most expensive part of the entire process was the vessel and the crew. And so when original contract language for getting kind of liability was in place, in order to get ocean vessels on the water, they couldn't really afford to put that on the owners of the vessel. And so a lot of the responsibility got put on the shippers. And even though that was in the 1500s when all of that was really being designed, that liability hasn't changed much because that was the standard that was set. And so in today's world, a lot of those old practices have kind of been carried forward, and it limits the responsibility of anyone in the transportation industry on what their responsibilities are. The balance to that is there are ways to get around that. And so you can buy insurance, whether it's through a freight forwarder, whether it's through a third-party broker. Sometimes companies, kind of larger insurance plans, will cover it. But it's really important to know, and I think you have one more slide here, what is your insurance responsibility and liability? And so from a cargo insurance standpoint, typically you can actually get a 10% increase over your valuation. So if you have the cost of your goods and all your freight charges along with the transaction, so let's just say that came out to $1,000, you can actually insure it for $1,100 to allow you some kind of, response to the pain of losing that. And so the benefit of that is you don't have to prove fault in a cargo insurance world. So it's a super, while liability is very kind of unprotected for the shipper, cargo insurance goes the other way where it almost overprotects the shipper. And the idea is they know that there are a lot of challenges being a shipper in an international environment. And so they want to make sure that shippers aren't afraid out of that space. And so cargo insurance is there to cover that gap. And it is done at times at a company level for an annual policy, and sometimes it's done as transactional insurance. What's important in both those scenarios is to ensure whatever coverage you have covers the value of your move. The last thing you'd want is $250,000 of insurance coverage, because that seemed like a good policy. And then you move a $500,000 move, have a total loss, and you're still out $250,000 even though you have an insurance policy. So it's really, really important that you look at what are your coverage limits so you can get that covered within your transaction. All right. So in conclusion, we covered a lot of ground. There are a lot of steps to the export process, and a lot of different people are involved. And so what's really important as we move through that is understanding what are your agreements, how are you transferring responsibility, and how are you covered to prevent loss within those responsibility transfers. And the reason that freight forwarders and third-party logistics providers like ourselves exist is we really, really enjoy supporting this endeavor. And so if you're considering exporting it and you're looking at how do I do this, it's not something you have to go out alone. It's something where whether it's the Department of Commerce in Idaho or the Department of Agriculture, a lot of people have really enjoyed this world, and we're here to help. And so what we want to make sure is you have some awareness of how complex this is, but at the same time, you have an awareness of the resources that are there to help you. And we would love to be part of that and answer any questions that you might have.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much for sharing, Michael. That was a lot of really great information. And we will be sharing all the slides with everybody and have them on our website too.
Awesome.
Yeah. So yeah, thank you, Michael, so much for that presentation. That was very informative. And at the end of our webinar here, we'll open up for Q&A. It looks like we had a couple of questions in the chat box. So, but for right now, I want to go ahead and turn it on over to Corey Marshall from Mill 95, who's going to share some of his experience using a freight forwarder.
Really is Corey?
Yeah, Corey, are you still on? You can go ahead and take over when you're ready.
Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry. I'm back.
No worries. Thank you. Go ahead.
If you don't mind, repeat the question.
Oh, I just wanted to go ahead and have you share your experience in using a freight forwarder and what's been important to your business when choosing a freight forwarder, and any kind of tips or tricks that you'd be willing to share that you think would be helpful for some of our new to export companies.
Yeah, absolutely. We have had the opportunity to use freight forwarders here at Mill 95. We've been involved in hiring them directly, as well as working with them through our customers. So fortunately or unfortunately, depending on which freight forwarder we're working with, we've had quite an experience with quite a few of them domestically, companies here from the United States and freight forwarders outside the United States as well. And I guess what I would say, there's a lot of things I would repeat from what we've heard today, but the way I've kind of looked at it, there's probably 4 big buckets that I think about and focus on when I'm using a freight forwarder and what I've seen from them. I think the first big bucket is really when you think about the complexity of all the countries out there, and everybody is different. It really have not found where we've exported to a country and we've been able to really duplicate exactly what we've done. So there's a lot of surprises, a lot of nuances, and a lot of knowledge that we can't really replace that a freight forwarder can bring to the party. So the first big bucket is really that knowledge and helping us from a strategy standpoint. When we look at going into a market, we really think about it strategically. And you think about it from a geographical standpoint. There's multiple destinations we can ship into. There's different modes. There's a possibility of what I would call using hub and spoke, right, where we're exporting into one country and then shipping out of that country to others. Sometimes there's a free trade zones involved that we need to consider. So thinking about it from an overall strategy and helping to set the stage for how we're going to export to a market is a big part of what we look at from a freight forwarder. Once we've got our overall, and by the way, another thing I would think about with that, and it's probably consistent with a lot of companies, is that you're going to be, usually when you're starting in a country, you're going to be starting somewhat small and then growing over time, right? Because as you enter in a market, you usually don't have this huge demand. And so there is a big strategy involved in how do I go from, starting and entrance into that market to becoming more of a mature market. And your needs and your strategy in a lot of ways will change over that time frame. So again, the big bucket there is just strategy overall. I think the second piece will be back to documentation. Depending on the markets, documentation is a huge piece. Again, none of it is consistent. Having somebody who's really knowledgeable, and I think as we talked earlier in this meeting, local knowledge is really important. So having people on the streets there who can help you, who can help decipher some of the formal and somewhat informal requirements in these countries. And as you start working with countries that are, less developed, there's a lot of informal that goes on that you've got to work yourself through. And a freight forwarder with local people on the streets really helps along those lines. I think the third big bucket is options. A lot of times I see freight forwarders who focus on whether it's ocean freight or container shipping, but not everybody has the full gamut of options that are available, from small package shipping, from refrigerated to dry to every need you have. So having a forwarder who can really is experienced in all of those fronts is another key piece that we look at. Then I think the other big bucket is control. The companies that we're working with, whether they're big shipping companies or air freight companies, there's so much demand that they have that they really have the upper hand, particularly for smaller companies. So you're at their mercy. We're really looking for someone to help us on the control side so that we can help meet our customers' needs from a timing, from a quality, all those perspectives. And a freight forwarder, we're really looking for somebody who can help us from that standpoint. So those are the big kind of buckets that we look at when we're looking at a freight forwarder. And again, we've had the experience to work with a lot of them. And I'll just tell you, we work with expediters from our standpoint. We have seen, like I said, many foreign countries that are working with other expediters, and whether it's cost or whether it's quality or whether it's service, we don't see the same level of expertise or any of the things in the buckets that I was just referring to. So I would just recommend that to check out expediters as you start looking at it as one of your options.
Great. Thanks so much, Corey, for sharing that information with us.
And no, he wasn't paid to say that.
We promise.
No, he wasn't. So really appreciate your candid comments there and helpful tips for everyone else again, Corey, and for Michael for speaking. And let's see, we're going to just go to Sarah now for the last little part of our presentation.
All right, great. Yeah, we're just going to spend the next couple of minutes here just doing a high level over what are free trade agreements, tariffs, how they affect your exports, and then we'll go right into our final Q&A. So to start off here, what is a free trade agreement? A free trade agreement is a pact between two or more nations to reduce barriers to imports and exports among them. Under a free trade policy, goods and services can be bought and sold across international borders with little or no government tariffs, quotas, subsidies, or prohibitions to inhibit their exchange. Next slide, Sharon. Currently, the United States has 14 free trade agreements with 20 countries. And as we mentioned, free trade agreements help your company enter and compete more easily in the global marketplace through zero or reduced tariffs and other provisions. While the specifics of each free trade agreement are going to vary, they generally provide the reduction of trade barriers and the creation of a more stable and transparent trading and investment environment. This makes it easier and cheaper for US companies to export their products and services to the trading partner markets. There's a link on this slide that, again, we'll send this out. If you click on that, you'll be able to find all the details of the free trade agreements that the US currently has with those countries. So some of the key benefits of a free trade agreement, again, is the reduction or elimination of tariffs on qualified items. So for example, a country that normally charges a tariff of 12% of the value of the incoming product will eliminate that tariff for products that originate in the United States. In this case, if that's who our free trade agreement is with. This makes you more competitive in the market. Number two would be intellectual property protection, the protection and the enforcement of American-owned intellectual property rights in that country. Third would be product standards, the ability for US exporters to participate in the development of product standards in that country. Number four would be selling to the government, the ability for the US company to bid on certain government procurements in that country. And lastly, fair treatment for US investors, providing that they be treated as favorably as the partner country treats its own investors and their investments. So what exactly is a tariff? As we've discussed earlier, a tariff is a tax imposed by a government on imports or exports of goods, also called a duty. It's important to recognize that the tariffs that are owed on imports are paid by domestic consumers and not imposed directly on the foreign country's exports. The effect is nonetheless to make foreign products relatively more expensive for consumers. But if manufacturers rely on imported components in their production process, they will pass that increased cost on to consumers. Often goods from abroad are cheaper because they offer cheaper capital and labor costs. If these goods become more expensive, then the consumers will choose the relatively costlier domestic product. There's a link here on this slide. I'll go back one second there, Sharon, if you don't mind. This link, you can go and see the different tariff rates. However, understand that this only applies to the free trade agreements that the US has. This doesn't cover other countries that we don't have the free trade agreements with. All right, go ahead, Sharon. So why are tariffs and trade barriers used? Trade barriers and tariffs are often used to protect infant industries, also developing economies, but they can also be used by more advanced economies and developed industries for various reasons. Some of those are protecting domestic employment or protecting customers. A government may levy a tariff on products that it feels could endanger its population. For example, South Korea may place a tariff on imported beef from the United States if it thinks that those goods could be tainted with disease. It also helps protect infant industries. The government of a developing economy will levy tariffs on imported goods in industries in which it wants to foster growth. This increases the price of the imported goods and creates a domestic market for domestically produced goods while protecting those industries from being forced out by competitive pricing. National security barriers are also employed by developed countries to protect certain industries that are deemed strategically important, such as those that support national security. Defense industries are often viewed as vital to state interests and enjoy significant levels of protection. For example, while both Western Europe and the United States are industrialized, both are very protective of their defense-oriented companies. And finally, retaliation. Countries may also set forth tariffs as retaliation technique if they believe that trading partner has not played by the rules. For example, the long-running trade dispute between the US and the EU over Boeing has resulted in the EU recently imposing tariffs on $4 billion worth of US products, including a 25% tariff that affects our high protein, that's on albums, our agriculture world, that's our high protein wheys. And in 2019, Idaho exported $21 million worth of high protein whey. So tariffs play a big role in exports, especially when you're hit with something like 25% tariff on that. So I was just going to give you a couple of good examples. The trade barriers is the US and China trade war that I'm sure most of you are also familiar with. It's just been a back and forth battle of tariffs imposed by each country as retaliation for the other's tariffs and has significantly impacted our exports to China. And then just a little bit on the USMCA, as I'm sure most of you know, NAFTA has recently been replaced with the USMCA. Much of NAFTA actually stayed intact, but some major changes came for the automobile industry in particular. But one good thing that came for agriculture was that it did open up some more access to the Canadian dairy markets for American farmers. All right, go forward, Sharon. So that's it. So we're going to open that up now for Q&A. And I did see that we had a question in the chat box. So I will read that. It's for Michael. So Alan asked, Michael, do you only ship in full container lots on ocean vessels, or do you consolidate various products to get a full container?
Yeah, so the answer to that is both. Be it Expeditors or any other freight forwarder, if you have enough goods to book a full container, we'll help you with that. And if you only have a little bit, but you still want to go ocean, we can help you do what's called less than container load LCL consolidation, where we'll commingle your freight with other shippers' freights and do a consolidated box.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions for Michael or for Corey?
Another question in the chat box, Sarah. If anyone could share information about payment options when paying a freight forwarder.
Yeah, so that's definitely another item to consider when you're interviewing freight forwarders is kind of what your financial situation is and how that commingles with their financial expectations. Some freight forwarders take credit cards, some do not. Some have cash terms, some have kind of multi-day invoice terms. It's really an important thing to evaluate, especially as a smaller or burgeoning exporter, because the last thing that you want is to put yourself in a cash-strapped position as you're trying to facilitate the trade.
Great advice. Anybody else? Go ahead and feel free to open up your mic and ask your question.
Hi, this is Kristen. Michael, I just want to first thank you for that talk. I've been doing this for a long time, and that was one of the most in-depth, informative talks I've heard in a long time. So thank you for that. I wanted to ask about original bills of lading and see if you've had experience where you've had freight released in certain countries without presentation of all original bills.
Hey, Kristen, I'm really struggling to hear you. So I'm hearing something about freight releases.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I'm having problems with my computer today, my camera as well. Have you experienced with original bills of lading where freight in certain countries is being released without surrender of the original bills of lading? I've been running into that in certain Central and South American countries.
So just to make sure I'm hearing the question correctly, have we experienced situations where it's on original bill of lading, but the freight has been released even though the bills of lading haven't been surrendered?
Correct.
So personally, I have not experienced that. I'm not surprised that it could happen, but I think generally what happens in those situations is one, there's a coordination issue, but two, there may be some relationships on the destination side that may be pushing for that freight release. I'd be pretty amazed though, because that'd be a huge liability on the carrier for doing that. And so, are you using freight forwarder? Are you using direct contracts with that scenario? I mean, that would be a really
yeah, I work on the banking side, on the financing side, and so we're requiring original bills of lading under a letter of credit, and we're finding that some of our clients' freight is being released in South American countries without surrender of the full set of bills of lading. Fortunately, they have the letter of credit to secure the payment of the goods, but
Keith, have you? I haven't heard of that very often. Have you, Keith?
Well, the short answer is, of course, these sort of things can happen, but as Michael referenced, legally, the transportation provider, if they are releasing the cargo to the consignee, to the buyer, without the original bills of lading being processed through the banks, that transportation provider opens themselves up to a huge lawsuit. I mean, the quickest way to solve that problem is for somebody to sue somebody. That's my experience. I've only seen it in a couple of instances where And actually, it's usually more the couple of times that I've been involved where there's been a situation where pressure has been brought to bear by the buyer here in the States, actually on an import transaction that was bought on a letter of credit. You know, again, Expediter certainly doesn't play that game, right? Because we're not going to release the cargo and open ourselves up to a lawsuit, even if we have credit terms established for the customer, right? Legally, again, if the transportation provider releases that cargo without the original bills of lading being surrendered, either at origin and doing a telex release process or being surrendered at destination, then the transportation provider opens themselves up to a lawsuit either by the shipper or by the consignee or by the bank. So it just really doesn't happen very often.
Okay, thank you.
Great questions. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is Todd English with Riverence. Michael, thank you for all the information. It's been super helpful. I was actually tasked with looking into freight forwarders this week, so it's very helpful to get all your information. I really appreciate all that. One of the things, so we're a trout and steelhead producer here in southern Idaho, and we are looking to export frozen product to Asia, to Romania, many different countries. And one of the things that we've struggled with in sort of this initial investigation, again, we've never exported any product to date, and we're hoping to in 2021, is understanding sort of the detention time for cargo containers. One of the things that we have to do is, let's say we ship it out of Seattle to Hong Kong. We'll need to get a container to Idaho for, you know, a long enough period of time for us to load it and then get it back to the port of Seattle. And a lot of the cargo companies that I've talked to have 2, maybe 3 days detention time, which is not feasible for us. And if after that, we're subject to the heavy fees. How can a freight forwarder help us in that situation? I would really appreciate any info.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's 2 dynamics to it. So one is, what is the freight forwarder capable of doing from their relationships with a contract standpoint?
Mm-hmm.
And then 2, what is the market willing to bear? So if you asked me that question in June of this year, I would have been able to get you 25 free days to do whatever you want in the container. No big deal. The challenge that exists now, especially within reefer containers, is the market is so tight from a container capacity standpoint. And the downfall of us being such a large consuming economy is that the market from Asia to the US is significantly more profitable than the US back to Asia. And so ocean carriers are actually taking the containers, they're not even letting exports be loaded and taking them back to Asia. And my point of all that is, it's caused a situation where your detention time is much less now than it was 6 months ago in terms of what I can negotiate. However, when you get to a larger freight forwarder, right, generally they'll be able to look at a larger contract base. So as an example, I have other frozen fish accounts, right, and it gets to the commodity level that we've negotiated contracts with in May, because in the ocean world, every May new contracts are negotiated.
In the Trans-Pacific.
Yeah, sorry, in the Trans-Pacific. In our world, regardless of what happens in the market, they can't change those agreements. And so part of it is negotiating with your freight forwarder to say, hey, what can you get me? Here's what I'm looking for, and being able to kind of identify that. The other thing to really think about is how are you going to manage the temperature on that container? So if it takes you a couple days to load it, you're going to need what's called a genset, which is going to run basically the refrigeration on a reefer. But you also have to think about the transportation time to and from the port and whether or not it can be plugged in on the truck or whether it's going to be a standalone. And then once it gets to the port, can it be plugged into the port? Most diesel generators have about 100 hours of fuel. And so if between the time that you're going to have it and the time it needs to get back to the port, it's not going to be able to be plugged in, you have to factor in that you only have about 100 hours in order to run that container. And so there's some unique dynamics that you, looking at a refrigerated or a frozen container, need to figure out. And then every market that you go to is going to have different times. So like South American markets generally have a little bit more free time built in, whereas European markets have a lot less free time. So I have one customer going to South America that has, say, 20 days of free time once it arrives, whereas in the UK, it's like 2 days is a standard. And so just depending on where you're going, those standards vary quite a bit as well.
Okay. Super helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Hey, Todd, the only other comment I would make to add to Michael's comments is that the norm in our business, the norm in the industry, is you get 5 working days from the time that the container is pulled out of the terminal to the time that it's got to be turned back. Typically, you get 5 free days, and then after those 5 free days, then they'll start charging you what's called a per diem or a demurrage charge, and those can be pretty expensive, right? Depending on the carrier, 150, 200 bucks a day if you go outside of those number of free days. But as Michael said, again, those things are negotiable in the ocean contract, depending on the size and the strength of the NVO and the relationship that they have with the underlying carrier.
So thank you for that. And if we work with a freight forwarder, are we, and maybe I missed it in the lecture that Michael gave, we are also required to have a contract with the ocean container, or is that done on behalf of the freight forwarder?
Yeah, so let's just use myself as an example. So if you told me, hey, I've got this shipment going to Korea, then you and I would agree on a price, and then it would be my responsibility to get you the ocean container, bring that to you, facilitate all those transactions at whatever price we agreed upon. And I think early in the presentation, they said, sometimes I might say, hey, it's all in price of, $1,000, or it might be, it's $500 for the container plus $100 for the chassis plus, it could add up to what seems like a nickel and dime. And so there's a balance in how freight forwarders present pricing to try and, one, be more transparent, but also not seem like we're charging for every breath that you take.
Yeah, I got you. No, super helpful.
Yeah, and also Todd, again, I'm sorry. So traditionally, freight forwarders do not sign contracts with shippers. We have the contract. We carry the contract as an NVOCC, like Michael explained, with the underlying carrier, right? Expeditors goes out. I mean, we've got a big book of business, right? So we'll go out to Hapag-Lloyd or CMA CGM or Hyundai or Evergreen or whoever, right? And we'll our corporate guys up there, sitting up there in Seattle. Again, depending on the trade lane, as Michael said, it's an annual contract in the Trans-Pacific, May 1st to April 30. So again, our guys will up the corporate and regional people in Asia. They'll be negotiating the contract with our contract carriers on an annual basis, and so we have overarching kind of rates and volume commitments and so forth with those carriers. We also have the ability to negotiate what are called bullet rates or special agreements for specific pieces of business and specific customers also. So anyway, so like Michael was referring to, if we know that a client needs, especially if you're down in Buell or wherever you are, right, with the trout, and you need some extra, you need instead of 5 days, you need 7. Well, okay, maybe the carrier won't give it for all of our customers, but they'll give us 2 extra days for you, whatever, right? And so we can kind of work that into the negotiation on our underlying contract with the carrier. Does that make sense?
Yep, makes total sense. Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
And I think that would generally be the trade-off in the market is if you went directly to a carrier, be it an ocean, air carrier, whoever it may be, they're going to look for a volume commitment to give you a rate. And so you're kind of required to give them something in order to get the response. A freight forwarder generally doesn't require a volume commitment from you. And so their hope is they can sell enough customers that they can give that commitment and then add flexibility to their agreement with you. And so we might charge a little more than you could get directly, but you have more flexibility. So there's trade-offs that go through the dynamic of, are you choosing to sign your own contracts? Generally, it's much larger importers and exporters that sign those direct contracts. We're talking Home Depots, Walmarts. There's kind of a magic size where you might have enough infrastructure that it makes sense. Smaller carrier or customers, are generally not looking to do direct contracts with carriers. They use the freight forwarder more often.
Yeah, here in Idaho, and Simplot, of course, has their own service contracts directly with the carrier. Mike Stanley, Stanley Hay, whatever. But for the most part, most of the other shippers are working with NVOs like us.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Awesome. Any other questions? Okay, so we'll go ahead and wrap it up then. Don't forget to register for session 4 next month, where we will wrap things up with learning about the benefits of an export compliance program, export financing and banking. So that will be a good in-depth one to sit in on, and navigating international laws and regulations.
All right, perfect. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, everybody. Have a very Merry Christmas.
January.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Guys.
Thanks, everybody.
Happy holidays.
Good stuff.
Thank you.